Hello there. In the next hour and a half or so, what I shall be doing is talking to probably the most successful husband and wife fishing team that I personally know, Kay and Dave Steuart. We are also very fortunate in having some of their original shot film, which we'll be going through with Dave and Kay. As most people know that Clive and I do an awful lot of carp fishing and are well into it, so I think it'd be very nice to start the tape off talking about carp. David, we've got some carp fishing sequences at the beginning of the tape. Would you like to give us some comments on the changes that you've personally found, you and Kay, over the last 25 years?
Yes, Malcolm, probably the most significant changes that I've noticed is the average size of the carp now, which are very much larger than they used to be. There's two changes, but the average size is probably the most significant. For example, 20 odd years ago, when I used to do a fair bit of carp fishing, it was a specimen carp was 8 pounds. The old Anglers News size limit was 8 pounds. Now it's about 20 pounds, and a lot of people don't take much notice of a carp unless it's 30 pounds. So there's a tremendous increase in the size of the fish. The other thing is the tremendous significance that people place on baits now. We had probably 3 main baits, which was bread, worms, potato, possibly 1 or 2 other things, cheese, but mostly it was those first 3 baits. Now there's significance with your boilies, for example, that you and Clive have evolved and use a lot with success. Reason being, I think, of course, is because the carp do tend to get onto one bait, get caught on it, get to know that there's hooks in it, leave it alone, and you have to introduce something completely different and get them onto that so that you can hook them on a new bait without them being scared of the original one.
That's quite right, yeah. Okay then, well, I think the best thing to do now is to start the film, and we've also got some nice course fishing on there as well, haven't we?
Yes, we've got Tench from Carp fishing, we run into Tench fishing, and then we've got, I'm not quite sure of the sequence, but we've also got Barbel fishing and Pike fishing, I think, on the course section.
Terrific. I think at that stage then we'll go straight into it.
Straight into the film. You can see how long ago that is, Kay, by the look of us. I've even got hair. Now, we're starting off with you landing a carp from the Tarn, water that you fish now, Malcolm, and I believe you got some big fish from it, don't you?
Yeah, Clive and I actually have been fishing it for a few years now, and the fish have grown enormous sizes to, I think, to when you was there last. Actual fact, the biggest one that we've had there is what Clive had at 29 1/4.
Yeah, well, that's very much bigger than what we caught. The largest we had was 18 pounds, which was the largest from the water, I believe, at the time, and the largest for quite a few years. Although, because in recent years they've been getting bigger and bigger and bigger as per your results.
That's quite right, yeah. I think they've had various stockings in there since you fished it, Dave.
Yeah.
And, of course, I think a lot of the fish are growing is attributed to the old angler's baits that get put in there now.
Yeah. CK's about to put one back. Treats them very, very reverently, these fish that she catches, those that she's going to put back, and there's a friend putting another one back. And she likes them so much she waves them bye-bye, you know. She does, honestly, I'm not kidding you. She sort of, you watch. Bye-bye. Those 3 are 3 fish that are in a net that's too small, really, but we'd caught 7 fish, actually, on this day, and we had 4 bigger fish in another net. And consequently, we thought it was a bit crowded, so we put these 3 smaller ones. I can't remember the weight, 6, 7 pounds, something of that. I think the best might have been about 9 pounds. We put them in that smaller net rather than cram them all into the larger net. Kay actually caught the 3 of them, and I think they were something like 7, 8, 9 pounds, as I remember. And this is another fish she caught from the high bank. You remember the high bank swim? Because I think you fished it quite a lot.
Yeah, how many years ago actually was this, David?
Well, this must be, I don't know, it's probably about 25 years ago, I should think. Maybe a little more. It's certainly a long time ago.
I think the lake's not changed at all since He was last over there, actually.
Yeah, it's amazing
Right up to
that.
date.
You would think that it would look different, growth of trees or rushes or something, but from some of your films I've seen, it certainly appears to be very much as it was then.
It certainly is.
What do you think, Kay? Do you remember that fish?
I do remember it actually, because I think I was all on my own when I caught it. I had to wake you up, didn't I? I think you'd gone for a doze, and I got it all on my own.
Yeah, that's quite possible. Serves you right, because that means you probably had to net it, and that's why we haven't got any film of her landing it. Whereas in this case, as you can see, Kay's filming me actually playing the fish, which moves. I think you'll see a shot in a minute where it moves way out. Yeah, do you see the splash way out there? A long, long way out. But there it is. Oh, there it is again, anyway. And we'll gradually then just pump it in. Now, you'll notice we're out in the water, Mal, and you've got to do the same, because it's surrounded with rushes, with just gaps in the rushes, and we have to walk out between the rushes so that if a fish moves off to left and right, we can keep the rod out beyond the rushes to save us getting snagged.
Yeah, still the same old
Still
thing.
the same, yeah.
I noticed there, David, you like the old soft rods.
Oh, I'm very fond of soft rods. In fact, I think you can do a hell of a lot more with soft rods, other than casting a long way. And yet, well, I say that's not quite true. You can still cast a long way with a soft rod, but probably to get maximum cast, you need one of these fast taper things. But you don't get the fun with the fish.
That's right.
You get much more fun with a rod like these, which really bend. Another point here, now this friend's about to net it for me. You'll notice I'm backing off away from him. Most people stand right next to you. Well, if they're going to do that, you might as well net the thing yourself.
That's right, yeah.
And it puts a lot of strain on the rod top. Whereas if you walk away about a rod length away from whoever's netting the fish for you, you don't have to strain your rod top at all. You can keep your rod comparatively low and he can net it for you. And consequently, it's a very simple process without any strain on tackle. There's another thing you might have noticed. As I was walking in there, we passed 4 buzzers.
That's
We
right,
put the rods out in the water. Now, I don't use 4 rods, 2 are Kay's and 2 are mine, but what we do is we used to like to fish together, but we used to like to stagger the tackle, so that if the fish were feeding in one area, say the left area, we used to fan the tackle so the rods were sort of as a fan. You understand what I mean, from left to right. Now, what we used to do was say Kay would have the first one, then I would have one, then Kay would have one, then I would have one. That way we both had a rod in whatever might be the hot spot. The hot spot denoting the feeding area of carp. These are 4 of the carp we used to catch then, not monsters like you catch today, but still a very nice bit of fishing.
They certainly look nice, though.
Oh yes, they were nice fish. The largest one Kay caught, because she's often doing things like that. I think that is the largest one I'm holding. It's your fish I've pinched there, Kay.
That was the biggest one I'd caught, wasn't it, from there? Which is 16.
And back they go to grow bigger, or live to a ripe old age, perhaps for this horrible beast Mal to catch.
No, I should think they're more likely to be the grandparents of the ones that Mel catches.
Yes, or even more older than that, because I don't know how old they live actually, carp, but
It's quite a few
20,
years,
30, 40 years possibly, so they could be the same fish in there. This is Horton Pool. We're feeding a few crusts in for surface feeding carp. After a while we managed to get them to take quite well on the surface. And you'll see a few coming up and whipping the crusts in a minute. Nice big piece on the hook. That's that. And
that's a water that's no longer there now, is it?
No, that's right. That's been filled in. The Water Authority built a Datchet Reservoir there, and the actual water was at a road junction right in the corner. The Water Authority filled it in, and they built the reservoir to the corner, but they came round it. They didn't go square, of course. They came round, and they actually missed where the water was. Consequently, they needn't have filled it in at all, so it could still give people enjoyment. Now, there's a line belting off, and a friend of mine, he's just about to hit that fish that's just taken that bait. Come on, wake up. That's it, get that hook in. It goes like the clappers. And now playing it, of course, and he brings it to net. It just gets it in the net, and we run out of film. It was a bit of luck, wasn't it?
Spot on.
Tench fishing. The water here, I daren't mention, is private club water, but it's a very good lake and used to be stocked with some quite nice tench. We've had £100 bags there on several occasions.
Indeed.
Oh yes, several occasions. We've caught fish up to £6, no monsters, but the average was high. We'd get an average of £4, which is quite nice.
It's very nice.
You know, if you got 20 fish, it was £80 a fish.
Certainly, yeah.
About a couple of years or so after the weight started to drop, and personally I believe that the tench does go in cycles, and you get cycles of big fish, and then a few years later you'll go right down maybe to £2 or £3 average, and then it'll creep up again.
Yeah, Clive and I have actually found that on a couple of the tench waters that we fish.
Yeah,
You get a big peak period of big fish, and say the next year they've all dropped down to an average size.
Yeah, that was quite a nice fish that Kay just landed then, probably about £5. And this is another big one that's obviously taken the hook down a bit, and it's a little bit difficult to unhook. But nevertheless, with all those fingers, we ought to be able to manage it. There's Kay netting another one.
Rather cack-handedly by the look of it.
Yes, it was, but never mind. You netted the fish. That was the main thing. That's another good fish. That's I think that one's over £5.
Yeah, certainly looks it, David.
Yeah, I think it was about. Just memory plays tricks, but I think it was about £5.6. Do you think that, Kay? I think it was 5, 6.
There was one, as you say, you can't really remember after
We had
a fair while, but I know I did have one of about 5, 6.
Yeah, we both had a few £5 there, but I think 5, 6 was that particular one we managed to film.
It's quite a large tench though, even going back many years, David. When you was actually catching them, 5, 6 tench. It was quite a big tench though, wasn't it?
Yeah, but they catch them £7 or £8 now, don't they? I mean, much bigger. But it's still a good fish, I'll give you that. And they fight very hard, that's the main thing. They're very good fighters.
They are terrific sport.
I like centre pin. You can see there we're using a centre pin reel. And it's very simple. You use your thumb on the edge and you brake when the fish runs slightly and brake hard in between, and then you can just wind.
I think it's a bit of a dying tradition though, David.
It is, it's a pity, because I think centre pin's a very, very good reel to use. That's another fish over £5. You notice we've got all £5-pounders. We didn't bother to film the £4-pounders, did we?
We used to catch too many.
Well, as I say, with an average of £4, we obviously caught a lot of £4-pounders.
Lovely.
If we thought we got a big one, we would film it. That's a catch of fish where the average has dropped down. They're only about £2.5, £3 average.
You seem to have a few there though.
Oh, there's quite a lot of fish there, but the weight's gone right down there. We stopped fishing it after that, but now it's coming back again, and they're getting a £4 average again, I believe.
We'll have to go back and have another shot at getting some decent ones.
Yep. This is a tench that got foul hooked when I was salmon fishing. I thought it was a salmon actually. I hooked it in the middle of some very fast water, and it took off with power, being foul hooked, and consequently I thought it was a salmon. Because it soon gave up on salmon tackle and came in sideways. The amazing thing perhaps is not catching a tench in a river and not perhaps foul hooking one, because all fish get foul hooked occasionally. Now we're walking a river for barbel. This is the Kennet, and a very good barbel river. You can catch a lot of barbel here, not necessarily very big ones, although there are big fish in odd spots up to 10 or 12 pounds, but I used to like going out and getting a bag of barbel, fish of possibly 3, 4, 5 pounds, 6 pounds, and you could on a good day catch possibly 20, 25 fish. Yeah. A friend of mine, Johnny Denman, and I, we had a 2-hour spell once. We caught 32 fish in 2 hours.
Amazing. Between
us, both fishing the same swim. It was full of fish. I had 21 and he had 11 in 2 hours.
They're a hard fighting fish, aren't they?
Yeah, oh yes, they're fantastic.
They don't give up very easily, do they?
Fight very, very hard. Fantastic fish.
It looks in prime condition, that fish there.
That is, and pure white belly. Remember we were talking earlier about the white bellies of fish. Well, that's got a pure white belly, beautiful pink coral fins. Only a little fella, but nice fish for all that. And back he goes. One thing you notice when you wander the banks of some of these rivers where they're not heavily fished is the foliage is very, very pretty. We've got beautiful weeds, but they're flowers.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, for example, in that shot, the
beautiful, aren't they?
red sort of bank foliage, red little flowers, and very, very pretty, those large cabbage leaf type things. And it's nice to be there, because once it's trodden down by anglers, it's no longer the same.
That's right.
It's pity, but there we are. You can also notice the streamy, weedy runs that we catch the barbel.
Lovely.
And the centre pin again, of course.
Yep.
We love the centre pin reel. Plus the float. We like catching them on a float if we can as well. We don't catch them on
nice
a barbel.
method.
Yeah. Maggot is a favourite bait of mine, very easy, and of course, again, I keep mentioning I'm a tackle dealer, but I've got stocks of maggots always, which makes it an easy bait for me to use. Another nice fish, also from the Kennet. These fish, some of these, when we used to fish the Kennet, I don't think they'd ever been caught before. Whereas the Kennet now, again, we're talking 20 years on, it's much more heavily fished.
That's correct.
And consequently, the fish get a bit of a bashing, and you get split fins and all that sort of thing.
There's a little one there.
Oh, very tiny, yes. You don't catch many very tiny barbel, but that was a very tiny barbel. You can see here the bank side. It's beautiful,
beautiful,
isn't it?
absolutely.
Beautiful, untrodden and untouched. Untouched by man. That little fish. Funny, we were talking about that tench being foul hooked. That was foul hooked on an 18 hook. Hook's too small to see, but right in the anal fin, and went like hell. That's a shot. Could be the Rockies, couldn't it? It's a
Could be anywhere,
lovely,
couldn't it?
yeah,
Beautiful.
It's a beautiful drop of water. And another one comes to net. I can't remember how many we caught on that occasion, but we had quite a few. Lightly coloured fish. Here's a few in the net. You want to be a bit careful when you keep barbel in nets, because they've got a serrated spines on the dorsal fin. You know about those, of course, and also on the anal, and sometimes the spines can get caught in the net. So you want a really big net. And even in those days, we used to weigh them fairly carefully, the same as you do today in some sort of net, so they didn't get harmed.
Okay, there was a nice catch, isn't it?
Yeah. They weren't all caught by her. I think we shared the catch, actually.
You're giving the game away.
Well,
I always say I caught them.
Well, we actually went on, I remember that, I'm pretty certain. We went on to catch a lot more, but in those days the film was so poor that we had to take in sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
And so consequently, oh, by the way, I'm interrupting here, but that's quite a big roach. We used to get the odd big roach when we were barbel fishing, and that one's somewhere around 2.6, 2.8, if I remember, yeah, so it's a big
It's a true
roach.
specimen, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that from the Kennet as well, David?
Yes, that's right, yeah. I was just saying that, as I remember, the light was so bad that we used to have to film when the sun was out, and consequently the shot like that one was taken midday, and then we'd go on after that in maybe poorer light and catch a lot more fish, especially towards dusk when they were feeding heavily. But we couldn't film it. We're down on the Avon now. This is the famous Christchurch swim on the Hampshire Avon. I say the famous Christchurch swim, I mean the famous Christchurch River, and I swim on that river.
It looks like the old Barbel, a little bit bigger there, David.
Well, yes, but that's still quite a small barbel, because you get or used to in those days, we used to get a lot of 10-pound fish from there.
I've certainly seen how clean the river is there.
Oh, it's beautifully clean, and the Kennet was clean as well there. But again, I tended to find shoal fish and like to catch a nice lot of fish in a day rather than fish for big ones. I've caught 10-pounders, but I would prefer to, even when I went down there, to get quite a lot of fish, and you would sometimes catch among your 4 and 5, 6-pounders, a 7 or 8 and 9-pounder, and the odd 10-pounder, rather than fish specifically for the bigger fish, which some people used to do. I like catching a lot of fish if possible, not little tiddlers, but a good catch of fish. This friend of mine who's just netting this fish, which, if I remember, weighed 9 pounds 12. I've got a good memory when I think about it all these years ago, but I remember that because he'd never caught a fish over 6 pound down there. I said, I'll take you to a swim and you'll get a bigger fish, and he got that one 9 pound 12.
Superb.
So he was very happy, and he went on to get 2 or 3 over 10 pounds after that. And yet another one coming to the net. A friend of mine looking at it in disgust there because he's not very big.
It's downstream on the parlour,
This
David.
is in the parlour, yeah, a famous pool for fishing for barbel, and of course it also holds chub and salmon and every other fish that a good mixed fishery like the Avon has. There's a beauty of fishing the Avon. You've got barbel, which this film is depicting, another quite a nice one covered in there. Well, that's one. It wasn't £10 quite, but I think it was about £9.14, £9.15. It was pretty near 10. It's a good fish.
Superb.
But you, as I was saying, you get these fish of nine and £10 barbel, but you also get your chub and your roach and your dace and all big fish, and then you've got game fish, salmon and sea trout, and occasional brown trout, but quite a lot of sea trout. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands, I suppose, of sea trout at times. Talking about this film business, you've got automatic cameras today. You probably noticed it went dark and then got light as a cloud went over the sun.
That's right.
Modern cameras would compensate for that, I suppose. It's another nice fish also.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Also up in the £9 or so. Light colour, it's very much lighter. They vary in colour. Some are very dark back with beautiful pink coral fins, and others are quite light in colour. This one is a much lighter fish. It's a good old friend of mine. We've done a lot of fishing over the years, he and I, and we've caught hundreds of fish together, I should think. Barbel and salmon and chub and practically everything going.
There he is again.
Yeah, well, he's catching a few bait here for me because we're going to go pike fishing. And in those days we were allowed to take fish for piking, providing they were sizeable. There was a size limit on the Thames then. This is knocking out bait, and if they were over a certain size you were allowed to take them.
Over a certain size?
Yes, they had a size limit. Now, there's still a size limit, but if you're fishing matches and that, they waive it so that you can weigh in little tiny things as well and build up a weight. But we liked our live baiting. There's always controversy over whether live baiting's cruel or not. But that'll always go on, and whether live baiting's cruel, fishing is cruel or whatever. But live baiting certainly is a good way of catching pike. A lot more successful than dead baiting. I've fished the two together on many occasions, and the live bait's always outfished the dead bait. This one took a live bait anyway. And you notice we're gaffing it.
Yes.
Now that's something that we don't do now. We used to gaff fish in those days, right in the tip of the jaw, so that it went just behind the jawbone and came out under the tongue, and it didn't harm the fish. We've caught the same fish, on one or two occasions after returning them with this little mark where we previously gaffed them. So we know that it doesn't really harm them. But we did have a young lad, talking to me once, and he said, "Okay, Dave," he was only a youngster, he said, "you can gaff them okay. But when people see you gaffing them, and they know you're an angler with a certain amount of repute or something of that you might give them the idea that it's very easy, and if they gaff them wrong, they kill the fish. So you shouldn't really show anglers gaffing fish, and since then I've used a net. Kay struck that one a bit hard, because you've got to strike pike hard to get the hooks into its bony jaw, but somehow I think she struck that one a little bit too hard. Because how that came about, somebody's child had caught this pike and they wanted the head set up. They brought the head into me to set up, so we thought we'd have a bit of fun with it and put it on film.
Also use the old multipliers.
Oh yes, we're fond of multipliers, and Kay's using there, it's a South Bend, I think, if I remember. And it's quite... Now Kay's gaffing that there, you see. You see, right in the tip of the jaw, doesn't do any harm. But nevertheless, we have stopped that practice now, and weighing it, not particularly big, about 11, 12, 13 pounds. Now this is back in the parlour. Peter Green, he's the fishery manager of the parlour. He told us when we used to fish it regularly, if we saw a pike, we could have a go at it. And so if we saw a particularly big pike, we'd have a try. Although really we were fishing there for barbel, sea trout or whatever. And we saw an enormous pike. And we caught a bait, and I gave it to Kay, and she dropped it down to try and catch this really big pike. And another one flashed in and took the bait, and it was about 11 pounds. But while she was playing it, this other great pike was swimming around with it. And it was enormous. It had a head like a shovel. I should think it was well over 30 pounds. Yeah, it was a huge fish. But after we put this back, it disappeared and we never saw it again, unfortunately. Here's another fish from the parlour on another occasion when we saw another big one. And again, it may well have been the same fish, it was later in the year, and again it had a head like a shovel, and again the wrong fish took. But on this occasion, as I say, it was near the end of the salmon and sea trout season, and on this occasion the powers that be netted the water at the end of the season to take out any salmon and sea trout that were left in the pool and put them upstream. And they netted out, I think it was 4 pike. One was 32 pounds, one was 28, one was 27, and there was a little baby one of 18. And they killed them all. Pity really, they could have gone to a decent water, you would have thought. Yeah.
Especially specimens of that size,
Yeah,
David.
yeah. This is a Steuart pike, 20 odd pounder,
That looks
21,
doesn't it?
22 or something. Yeah, that was quite a good big fish. So they are. Keep still for daddy. Whopping great head, haven't they? Big pike. And national health teeth, of course. And they've got a lot of teeth. They've got 3 rows on the top and they're all over the tongue, as you know. This is spinning for pike, quite a good fun method. I like spinning for pike. You don't generally get the big ones, not an ordinary little spinner, but you get a lot of fun with 6, 7, 8 pounders in a river, and they can fight much harder sometimes than the bigger ones. They're lively and quite good fun.
Again, you're going for a few fish again.
Oh yes, it's something I like to do now and again, is on a cold winter's day, is just go through the river with a spinner, not worry about catching big ones, but just go through the river and knock out a few fish of this sort of size, 6, 7, 8 pounds, and hope that occasionally we do pick up a big one.
I noticed there your hand in that one.
Well,
David.
it's a small fish and I often take pike out by hand.
Back he goes.
Yep, back he goes. And in the same place as I was spinning with that, a little later in the season, Kay got a very nice fish. I was down the river fishing and she waved and I came up. She'd got this fish more or less played out by the time I got there. It looks as if we're fishing very shallow, but it's a sliding float, so it's not quite as shallow as it looks. But she's gaffed it. Since back in the days when we used to gaff them, and fish she just about managed to drag up the bank. It's a big fish, I suppose, for her, because she's short, and I think it was 21, 22 pounds, something like that. Give her a kiss.
Lovely old fish, Kay.
It is a nice fish, yeah. I enjoy my pike fishing, you know, I like a day out like that. It's very enjoyable.
I'm supposed to put them back gently though, Kay. You sort of almost fell in with that one.
Yeah, I was going to say I was going to go with it.
I hope you waved it goodbye too, as you usually do.
That's a superb shot there, isn't it?
Well, it was shallow water and it had to go off for quite a way before it could get into deep enough water to go deep. That's one of our perch that we catch. We don't take much notice of those when we're spinning, but it's a good perch.
Beautiful.
Well over 2 pounds.
We hope that you enjoyed that sequence of footage there, and I think you'll agree there's some very nice fish on it. I think what a lot of people don't realise as well, that David is quite an authority on setting up fish, and we have actually got a fish that David set up here with us today. I think you'd like to come in on the setting up of fish, David?
Yes, certainly,
And,
Malcolm.
Give us some little tips, maybe.
A very brief outline, because obviously it's a long job and I could talk on it for a long time. But briefly, you have to skin your fish. Generally, that means you take your fish and have the best side, the best looking side. There might be scales missing or something like that, so you have your best side facing upwards. That's obviously going to be your show side. The other side, it doesn't matter, so the rotten side is the side you cut. And you cut it roughly where the lateral line is, not necessarily, because a lateral line doesn't necessarily go straight down the centre of a fish, but roughly from just behind the gill cover. There's a bone that runs behind the gill. That's the sort of the start of the body. From there you run your knife or scissors or whatever you're going to use, depending on the size of the fish, right through almost to the very end of the tail. Now you've then got to very carefully peel the skin back. So as you're working a blunt knife, a rounded type of kitchen knife, something like that, you've got to carefully peel the skin away from the flesh, and you gradually work back on the top. Well, it's the bad side of the fish. You work back until you reach the dorsal fin. You do the same on the lower side of the fish, round towards the belly, until you reach the pelvics, the ventral fins, and the anal fin, and run it also, of course, right back to the tail. So you've got the skin laid back with all the flesh showing.
So in actual fact, you're actually peeling the fish.
You're peeling the fish, yes, that's a good way of putting it. Then, of course, having reached the dorsal fin, there's bones that run from the backbone, rather like I'm interlocking my fingers here, from the dorsal fin into bones that come from the backbone. You know how fish bones are, they sort of stick out from a central column. And they interlock like that. So your peeling stops there. So you have to snip away those bones so that you can carry on then right round the fish, you see.
It's very intricate.
Yes, the same, you do that the same with your base fins, your pelvics, your ventrals, your anal, you do the same things there. You cut those through so as you can work round until you can get your hands right round and actually meet.
Oh, I see.
And then you snip through the backbone right at the base of the tail. You do the same near the head, and you should be able to, if you've done the job properly, you should be able to lift the whole of that big piece of flesh, which if you like eating the things, I don't like fish much, but if you like eating the things, you can lift it out in one piece and cook it or whatever you want to do with it. Give it to the cat or feed somebody you don't like with it or whatever. Then you've got a head, of course, which is still full of flesh. You want to, if possible, get as near to the skull as you can. So I personally gradually chip away the backbone until I've got right to where it's attached to the skull.
So
And then remove the rest of that flesh. You take out the eyes, and you take from inside the eye socket, you take out the flesh of the cheeks. Because as you can appreciate, if you leave it in there, it will go rotten.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to remove that. You've got to remove flesh from under the tongue. There's several places. Generally the skull is not touched, it's left to dry. And you put preservative on, of course, on the skin, and it's left to dry so that you put a bit of plaster over that to re-smooth it, because it all shrivels in and becomes a death's head, if you understand. You understand what I mean? All the skin shrinks into the bones, and you've got a very rough, you can see, rough head. You can see it on old fish where people haven't actually plastered the...
What sort of plaster do you use? Ordinary?
Well, I use polyfiller now. In the old days, they used ordinary plaster. For filling the fish, after you've done that, you've got to fill it, of course, this laid out skin, you've got to fill with something to bring it back to shape. They used to use killed plaster, the professionals. I use sand, ordinary sand. Fill it up with sand, and then you bring it back to shape and sew it up down the original cut. The thing is that you must make sure that you pack this in as tight as possible. It must be very, very tightly packed in, because it'll pack itself down, plaster or sand or whatever will pack itself down, and if you don't put it in very, very tight, the fish will shrink and become all bumpy, and the sand will give to it, you see, and it's got to be, that's very important, it's got to be very, very tight. One thing I forgot to say, you've got to take the gills out, of course, you know, the red gill filaments. You've got to take those out.
Sometimes since you've done one, you can't
Oh, it's
remember.
a long time, yes, I don't do them now, I just haven't got time, but I'm just trying to remember exactly what I do. It's left then, there's the fins, of course. Having laid it out like that, I usually then roll it over onto a board. That's my setting board. And shape the top of the fish to what its original shape, we hope. But you've got the fins, which are all floppy, so we set those out either with a piece of card on each side, which you can use ordinary paper clips, so that they're set up. You know, when you look at a case of fish, the fins are sort of sitting out firmly, and you get them to sit out like that, and they dry actually firm, and the skin of the fish will go firm, like what was the old stuff they used to write on? Parchment, yes, that sort of thing. That becomes firm, and the actual shape of the fish becomes firm, and even if you didn't put any filling in it, providing it remained dry, it would be its original shape, or the shape it dries out to, which is why the important business of filling it tightly.
Do you ever work to a photograph or anything?
I use photographs. We also use an outline of the fish, so that when we reshape it back to the original outline. For length, because otherwise the skin is very malleable, and I suppose you could make it very long and thin, or you can make it very short and fat, and to get it back to its original size you really want to draw an outline. Photographs are useful, especially coloured photographs, for painting it. After it's dried out, it loses most of its colour, so you've got to paint it. Now I think it's important to paint it boldly, very boldly. Some of the old professionals used to paint them just rather a light colour wash, and after a time that fades and you've just got a sort of browny varnish afterwards, and all you've got is the colour of the varnish and very little colour of the fish. And you'll rarely see the old fish with a white belly. 90% of our fish have got a pure white belly, and I think you've got to give it a pure white belly. You've also got to paint the fins brightly, the colours they are. Roach are very vivid, and you want to paint roach vividly. It might look wrong perhaps to your eye, but if you remember the fish that you caught and took out the water, especially a clean lake, the colours are absolutely vivid.
Yeah, certainly are. I think a lot of people, as you say, don't realise how vivid coarse fish and some sea fish.
Yeah, I think people are frightened of colours.
And
I
think they should be drab and sort of...
Yeah, they think fish are a camouflage thing, and but they are really very bright fish, very bright. And certainly when you take them out of the water, and that's how you see them. Another thing is, of course, in the water, a fish isn't glistening as you see it on the bank. But when you varnish a fish, you give it a coat of varnish, and it's shining and glistening with the varnish, it's not really as it would be seen under the water, but it's as you see it. And this is important, I think, that you want to depict the fish as the angler would see it,
right, yeah.
not necessarily as it actually is, if you like.
Right, yeah. It all sounds very time-consuming, Dave.
It takes a long time. Skinning a big pike would take possibly a whole evening. You might then... a professional possibly could do it much quicker. I don't know. I've never seen professional work, but you would probably... he would take, say, a couple of hours to do one. The actual moulding of the thing, I usually do this in 2 stages. I'll sort of fill it with sand and do that the next day. I'll put the skin in water to keep it wet in a bowl or something, fill it up with water, which will keep it from drying or becoming hard until you actually fill it. So you can do it in 2 stages. The question of drying out, I like to give them about a year. Now that might sound a long time, yes, but I think you want to give them a year, because it's not just a question of the thing becoming hard, but there's always a certain, however carefully you clean it, there's always a certain amount of oil, and you want to try and get that out. There's various things you do, preservatives, borax, and various other things you rub into the skin. I can't go into all that here, but other ways of doing it. But the longer you leave it, the better your fish will be. And because if you say to somebody, oh yes, I'll do that for you, it'll take a year, they don't like it very much sometimes. But look at it this way, if a professional gives them a price now, in a year's time, they're not giving him so much money, are they?
I think it's a dying trade though, is it, David? This,
it is, yes.
Fish.
Anglers don't like killing fish. This is one of the things.
No, I think that on the more like our years now, the depiction is not to kill the fish, only if it unfortunately dies.
Well, I think that's right. I don't think fish should be killed unnecessarily. But then you could catch a whopping great pike in a salmon river or a trout river where it's better out, unless you think that you should have pike in there eating all the salmon or the trout par or whatever, or salmon par. The question of killing pike, some are going to get killed, so rather than waste the carcass, you might just well, if it's a really big fish, it might just as well be preserved.
I understand it's very pricey to do it now, isn't it?
It would cost you a lot of money. I should think a £20 pike costs about £200, possibly more, yes, if it's done by a good professional, possibly more. But as in every other form of fishing, if you want a fish set up, or stuffed, or preserved, whatever term you wish to use, you first got to catch the thing.
That's right. I must say, I've seen some of your fish that you have set up, though, and they have been very, very impressive.
Thank you.
Well, that takes care of the coarse fishing section on Dave and Kay. The next section that we'll be going into is the grayling and the trout. And I think it'd be nice if we started with David showing us some of the trout laws. David.
Yes, Malcolm. I suppose grayling fishing is done a lot with baits that's similar to coarse fishing. Trout fishing is nearly all done by fly fishing. There are cases where people fish with worms and that sort of thing, coarse people, but mostly it's fly fishing. We have here these are lures which are used mostly in reservoirs. Grayling fishing is done mostly with small flies like these. We've got old-fashioned flies there like Peter Ross, so they also catch trout. Of course, nymphs, a lot of nymph fishing is done for grayling. A lot of grayling are caught on nymphs. But the fancy things are mostly what they use in reservoirs for trout. There are thousands and thousands of flies, absolutely thousands of different patterns. Many are invented every day. Everybody who goes fly fishing thinks he can invent the perfect fly or lure. Say those are flies and those are lures, which will catch, you know, it's infallible. There's nothing ever been invented that's infallible for catching fish, else you might as well give it up if it was an absolute certainty. But nevertheless, people do design flies and think they're going to make something that's really good. And some of these are good. This one designed by Dick Walker, which is called the Sweeney Todd, is a very good fly. I've caught dozens and dozens of trout on it, and there's many others. But you can see they're pretty things, very pretty things.
Do you think the general trout angler thinks more of flies as a fashion these days?
Well, they like collecting them. People who tie flies tie them by the hundred because they get interest out of tying the flies, I think, as much as they get the interest out of actually fishing.
Do you actually tie your own flies, David?
No, I don't. No, I'm a tackle dealer, as you know. I've got a shop full of the damn things. I'm not going to tie them. It takes hours. I just couldn't get any...
If he wanted to, anyway.
I couldn't get a lot of interest out of tying flies, frankly.
No.
No, I'd find it rather boring. I've got all the gear, and I might tie the odd one. I've tie a few salmon tubes and that sort of thing, but trout flies I can't be bothered, to be perfectly honest. But it is a very interesting thing for the people who like tying flies.
Well, imagine, yeah.
And they make beautiful creations and they all catch fish.
They look very nice in hats.
They are lures. These are lures also, I think, mostly. Yeah, we see again pretty. A lot of these are different to the others. There's hundreds and hundreds and thousands of different ones. But dry fly fishing, which a lot of anglers consider to be the best form of fly fishing, I think, frankly, is about the easiest form of fishing.
Yeah.
And I can upset people by saying this, but you see, unlike coarse fishing, to be a good coarse fisherman, you've got to know where fish are. In other words, you go to a river, you look at the river, and you can say to yourself, well, that little fast bit of water will hold barbel, and that little fast bit of water will hold chub, or the edge of the fast water will hold chub, and you'll get pike in that slack, and so on and so forth. But the trout fisherman, especially the dry fly fisherman, he doesn't throw his fly unless he sees a fish rising.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got in his favour, the first thing he's got in his favour, he knows exactly where the fish is. The second thing, he knows it's feeding. The third thing, he knows what it's feeding on. So providing he can throw a rough pattern of that fly at that fish, unless he makes a muck up of the casting, he's going to catch it. And it's as simple as that. You know where the fish is, you know it's feeding because otherwise it wouldn't be rising, and you know what it's feeding on because you can see the flies coming down the river that it's taking.
I suppose this is the art of the dry fly, isn't
Well,
it?
yes, and people consider it to be the best form of fishing. Personally, I think it's the easiest. It's very, very nice fishing, mind you, to see a fish throw a fly and catch it. But I don't think it's as difficult as people make out.
Far different from the chuck it and chance it on the reservoir style.
Oh yes. Again, we've got hundreds and thousands of flies for trout fishing, which are created, these to copy, unlike the lures for reservoir fishing, these are created to copy flies, real natural flies. I don't think they look really like flies, to be perfectly honest, but they are roughly the size and the trout think they're, and roughly the colour, and the trout thinks that they're whatever they're feeding on, and that's all that matters. So up comes the fish and takes them. This little screwdriver, which I magnetise, is useful for picking up little flies out of a box. Incidentally, I prefer the boxes. Unlike this, the idea of these boxes is so when you open your box, you take out a fly, and all the others don't blow away in a windy day. But I prefer the open ones where they do blow away, because as a tackle dealer I can sell them another lot then. But it is a magnetised piece of metal like that. For getting flies out of a box like that is much easier. It's a little tip that may or may not be useful.
Definitely. Well, I think the best thing to do now is actually go and see David catching some grayling and some trout.
Bringing a grayling to net here. Very nice fish, a fish that everybody hasn't caught because they're confined to quite clean and clear streams. Not native to every river. They're not native to this river. This is the Dorset Stour, and Grayling aren't native there, but they were put in and they've thrived. They've done very well. A lot of people, especially trout fishermen, don't like them in their rivers. They look upon them as vermin, yeah. But they are nice fish. I like catching grayling. And you can catch them quite easily, trotting down one after the other. You can pull them out like dace. But they're bigger and they fight hard. They go up to £2 or so, which dace don't.
What, you're fishing there with maggots and float, David?
Yeah, that's the usual way I fish. Little red worm, bread. We've even found that recently they take sweet corn quite well.
Yeah?
They'll take anything. We've always caught them on bread and worm and maggot, and very shallow water. You probably noticed we're standing in water only ankle deep, and you'll catch grayling in water that is only ankle deep. It's a wonder that the water's deep enough to cover their huge dorsal fins, because they have got this huge dorsal fin, enormous fin. I don't know quite why it's there, but when they're backing downstream away from you, certainly with the current pushing on it, they pull quite hard in a current because of it, I think. And they fight in a peculiar manner. When they're twisting and turning, the tail almost touches the head. So you can imagine you've got this terrific arc, and with the current pushing into it, they'll actually take line, even if they're not necessarily very big fish. So you can't just yank them straight upstream.
And you're on a weir sill there, David?
Yes, it's the same place actually as Kay caught the pike in the last bit of film. And there's grayling there. There's grayling all through rivers, and no doubt the pike take grayling as well as they take anything else.
I should imagine they'd make quite an appealing live or dead bait, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I've never used them. Something I don't like about using grayling for bait, although they breed very fast and probably it wouldn't do any harm, but there's just something that I don't like about using grayling. There's that huge fin I was talking about. You see, it's really enormous.
Huge,
No, it is absolutely enormous. It's the height of the depth of the fish.
Incredible.
Yeah, it is. You see again there, very, very shallow water. And somebody watching a friend and I batting them out, and we're catching a lot of fish. You can catch 40, 50, 60, 70 grayling in a day on a good river. Oh yeah, on a good river. The average, I suppose, would be about 20 to 30 on a reasonable river.
Smashing.
That's a younger grayling, and they're much prettier. They're covered in spots, which they seem to lose as they get older. And the fin is more coloured, the actual bars that run along the dorsal fin are very much more highly coloured than they are when they get older.
Looks like a little bit of a lively catch on the...
Yeah, you shouldn't put grayling in nets really. They tend to not take nets very well, and they can die. We were very careful to get this shot. We put them in a very big net, but if you put them in a net they can die, so I would advise people, if they want to preserve grayling and don't want to kill them, put them straight back. There's a trout or two there, got mixed up with the grayling that we were catching. A brown trout, still got red spots. Usually they seem to lose their red spots when they get up to a couple of pounds or so, but that one's still keeping its spots. Happy, he's waving his tail. There's a big grayling we're about to net here, a £2 plus. I suppose a specimen grayling must be £2 now. The record's somewhere around 212, 213. And we catch them fairly frequently, up to almost that weight. A friend of mine had one £2.10 a couple of weeks back. Yeah, and we catch lots and lots of £2-pounders. That's not on the Stour, that's on the test. But we've had £2-pounders on the Stour where we're fishing here. And we're of the opinion that probably there are fish there that might go to 2.5 or even 3. The river's rich enough to grow them to that size.
Superb.
Trout fishing in rivers such as this little stream. This is the little river Avon at Oxford. That's another sort of fishing we like doing. Again, that you don't get monster fish. Not the sort of size you get in these ponds where they stock huge things, or even reservoirs where they tend to stock them with quite large fish. But you get fish about £1, and if you're using a nice little light rod, and it's nice fishing. I consider it's pretty easy fishing. Well, it is actually pretty easy fishing. But it's nice fishing. There's a fish cruising around there now.
That's
Although
a
that's
nice
not actually rising. If you see a fish like that, you can put a dry fly to it and quite often they'll take it. Or failing that, you can fish a nymph, a very tiny little nymph. I've used nymphs on size 18 hooks, tiny little things you can hardly see.
Tiny, isn't it?
And you can't see the fish take it, but if you drift past a fish and you see his mouth open and close, then you can say to yourself, he's got my nymph, and you give a little lift of the rod, and 9 out of 10 times you're right, and you've actually hooked him, although you haven't seen him actually move to the thing.
That looks a lively one there, David.
Yeah, they are lively. This one tries to jump over that nettle, I think, yeah.
Oops.
And they're lively little fish. They're very fast. Trout are a good fish to catch. It's a thing that a lot of ladies like. They take up fly fishing for trout. Well, for one thing, there's nothing messy about it. A box of flies in their pocket, a little fly rod, and they can wander the river and catch fish with the rest of us.
It's usually on a nice day. You don't have to go out in the rain, and you can pick your days much nicer.
Lovely.
Well, this is true to a certain extent. You do get nice hatches of fish on nice hatches of flies on nice days.
Do you prefer fishing for the trout in the rivers, David?
Well, I do, yes, from the point of view of fun. Although I like reservoirs if they're big reservoirs, not little ones, big, almost natural reservoirs where they've dammed a stream and it's turned into a huge reservoir. I'm supposed to put those back gently. That's a chub that was caught by accident. But no, the reservoir fish grow bigger, and if it's a big reservoir, they're almost like wild fish, not necessarily put in large. They're a handful at times. They strip off line like a salmon or sea trout, 3 or 4 pounder.
Do they indeed?
It feels like a 10 pounder sometimes. But these little fish that we're catching here are still well worth catching.
Yeah, they're certainly putting a
Quite
good account
nice
of themselves up, aren't they?
Oh, they do. They do. And they're pretty, and you don't have to kill them, you can put them back. This is downstream fishing, actually, for trout on the Dorset Stour, which I used to fish a lot. And fish a wet fly, fish drowned, which is a form of fishing some fly fishermen consider as rather unsporting. But on that river, you didn't necessarily get a good rise to the fly from trout, and the trout were rather sparse, there weren't so many. But with a downstream wet fly, we used to catch quite a lot, and quite good fish at times, and the odd sea trout as well used to get up there. We used to get the odd fish up to maybe 5 pounds,
Indeed.
which is a nice trout. Lifted out with a rod, not good for your rod, but nevertheless it's not a very big fish. Yeah. This is a big reservoir. This is Chew Valley. Trying to chuck across the other side with the look of it. Double taper line, and it takes a lot of effort to get that out. But when you get a longish cast, because you've got more water to cover. So although long casts aren't necessary, especially when fish are taking close, a long cast when fish aren't taking will cover more water, should cover more fish and give you a greater chance. So it's a good idea to learn to cast a long way.
Looks very nice there, David.
Well, didn't have to cast so far there, because you can probably notice I paddled out a damn long way from the bank. In fact, so far that Kay's got to use a telephoto lens. Trouble being, of course, that it's handheld and it's a bit jerky. However, she's got a bit of a shot of us catching a fish there, and a long walk back in. But there was a spit out there, and the water's quite low, and I found this spit. And I thought there must be fish if it drops away, and I walked out to the edge of it, and it did. It dropped away quite deeply, and there were a lot of fish patrolling it, so we caught our limit fairly quickly by doing that. This one's a cock rainbow. It's not so pretty as some of the reservoir fish, which are bright silver and almost sea trouty to look at. That's a cock fish that's got a bit of colour. One we're bringing in now, if I remember, is a much nicer looking fish. See, it's bright silver, pure white belly. Yeah, it's a nice fish, that was. This is Blagden, another reservoir in the same complex as Chew. And it's the prettiest reservoir I know. It's a beautiful place. That's the dam end we're fishing. But it's a dam valley, and it's one of the oldest of these dammed valley reservoirs. Goes back a long time, trout fishing there, right back to the 20s, I think.
Was it indeed?
And I think it held the record rainbow at one time, which was only 8.5 pounds. That was a very big fish at the time. Whereas now the record rainbow, I don't know what it is, it's up in the £20, I think.
I think it is, yeah.
Caught from this Abington, I say pond because it's, compared to a reservoir, it is a pond. And they put in these big fish and people pull them out. But,
That looks a nice catch of fish there, David.
oh yes, I think you'd have more fun on a reservoir like that.
So back on the old river
Back
again.
on the river, yeah, we're chopping back and forth a bit, but probably because it's the river I like best.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the river's nicer. Moving water, there's always something going on, and something to see, animals and life. There's plenty of life at a lakeside, but you seem to get more in a river. Seems to be more going on all the
It
time.
seems to be living, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly, yes, it's got more life. Problem, of course, with our rivers is pollution always. That
Unfortunately so, yeah.
yeah, that's a big sea trout I caught at the Avon. In fact, there's the fish with another one. And it's my best sea trout so far, 11.5 pounds, and
Very nice.
and the other one was 8.25, I think. So it was a good place of fish.
Very nice indeed.
And that's just putting some of these are brown trout, just loading up the van with some brown trout, which we always drop one or two off to the farmer, you see,
Mhm.
because it's worth a little present to be able to drive across the field instead of having to walk miles.
Right, it takes care of the Grayling and trout section. And the section now we go on to is probably David and Kay's specialist section, the salmon. I think David and Kay over the last few years have specialised in this sport. We'll ask him why in a minute. But I think we'll go straight to you, David.
Thank you,
Go
Malcolm.
through it.
I think most people probably associate salmon fishing with fly fishing. Certainly people who don't go fishing for them, as they think of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and it's all fly fishing, or mostly fly fishing for salmon. So I think best thing perhaps is to show a few flies now. These are salmon flies. They're very pretty. These are old-fashioned salmon flies, but they do catch fish. They're not necessarily used a lot on some rivers today. Some people still swear by them. Others prefer the more modern flies. This, for example, is an old type of fly, supposedly to represent a prawn.
It's quite a large fly, David.
It is a very large fly, and flies in the old days were used very much larger than this. For one thing, the heavy fly did get them down deep in the spring. In summer, when the water's low, you can use much smaller flies, even for fish as large as a salmon. They'll come up and take on the surface or near the surface a fly that can be not much larger than you'd use for small trout. A little fly like that, for example, which we call a small double. It'll fish just under the surface, and a great big fish will come up and take that fly.
It's quite surprising the size of that one,
It
isn't it?
is, and yet, 20-pounders or possibly 30-pounders, maybe even bigger, have been caught on flies of that size. They're the more modern type of fly, of what we call single flies, the smaller ones. But nowadays, for big flies, instead of these old-fashioned ones, anglers prefer to use what they call tube flies, which are these. I haven't bought a lot. There's hundreds and hundreds of these, as there are hundreds of every other type of fly. Now this is a tube fly. It is tied round a tube, which could be even a biro tube, which is chopped up. A bit of dressing is put round it, some dressing, a little bit of ribbing, and a treble hook. Now the thing is that a treble hook hooks better than a single hook. It's a better thing to hook fish, and I think that's why there's a popular. Now you can see there's a great difference in this than the very fancy artificial fly tied by the old dressers. There's nothing to it, and yet that'll catch fish just as well as the fly that looks more perhaps presentable to the angler rather than the fish.
So that one actually more represents a spinner, David, is it?
Well, nobody knows what it represents. It doesn't represent a spinner. It's just something drawn through the water. And if you appreciate that if anything goes through water to a fish, it must be alive. So if something's going through the water, the only way it can find out whether it's alive is by grabbing it. And if it grabs it, you've hooked it. And that's the end of that poor fish, we hope, providing it doesn't come off. There's lots and lots of different types of and colours of these things. This is a Waddington. They're not tied with a tube. They use a piece of wire attached to treble one end and obviously an eye the other end. And that great long thing, which is rather large, is used in the spring for spring fish usually, and you go down to much smaller ones in the summer.
I see, I've noticed a lot of colour on that one. Is there any preference on the colours for the colour of the
Well,
water?
early in the year there might be a lot of colour in the water because of flooding, because of rains, and so the colour shows up, and yellow's a very good colour, as you know, for showing up in water. You would probably use a yellow colour for pike if you were coarse fishing, wouldn't you? And yellow is a colour that does show up well, especially if the water's a bit coloured. Black is a good colour. Black shows up against the sky.
Yeah.
So black, although it doesn't appear to be much of a colour, it's still a good colour to use for salmon
Especially
fishing
for
when
fish.
you're fishing a fly high on the surface or near the surface.
Do much fly fishing at all down here, David, at all?
I don't, because the river I fish, the River Test, they do a lot of weed cutting. It fills up with weed. The river keepers cut it, and there's continuous weed coming down, and all the time practically, and consequently it makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to throw a fly. And so I don't, although I'd like to do more fly fishing for them, I do very, very little. It's not very often that conditions are suitable.
So that's all we're really worried about is the conditions as opposed to fly fishing.
Oh yes, the conditions do make a great deal of difference.
The size of the river doesn't make a lot of difference.
Not really, no. No, I mean, you can use a fly on a little tiny river or a great big river. It makes no difference at all. What we use in the Southmoor are spinners, of which there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different sorts. The common one in our southern rivers, the yellow belly, again yellow because of showing up in dirty water, is this one here. That's a metal one. And the yellow belly spins round. There's a treble hook, a wire, shank. The spinner spins round this, of course, and flashes. I expect you can see that. That would act as a flash. And, of course, the
That's what attracts the
flickering
fish.
or the flashing attracts the fish, and up he comes and takes it, we hope. When the water's cleaner, we can use a blue and silver. These are called Devon minnows, and they go again down to smaller ones, which you use in the summer when the water's cleaner. Now, there's another thing we use also, a plug. This is called a floppy. It's a plug that I like very much. I've caught a lot of fish on these, and unlike a spinner which revolves, these actually swim. They swim through the water. It will come through the water like that sort of action.
The more fish-like.
And the fish like it, and I've caught a lot of salmon on them. Then there's plain spoons. That's a simple plain spoon. There are legions of these, hundreds and hundreds of different colours, patterns, sizes, thicknesses. The thickness of metal can be essential because a thick one, heavy, will go down deep.
Mm-hmm. Is this
And a
important
lighter
when
one.
fishing these type of lures, David?
Well, it's important again in the spring. Fish are deep down and they won't necessarily rise to a spoon, whereas they will take one that gets down to them and they don't have to move very far for it. If you think it's simply that the metabolic rate of the fish when the water's cold is such that it doesn't want to move far, well, perhaps it can't move so fast. And it'll take something that goes near it rather than take a fast moving, high fishing bait. The normal spinner, what we call normal, is a bar spoon, this type. Again, something which revolves round a bar. It's called a bar spoon for that very reason, and the spoon spins round a bar. It spins very, very fast. It's very, very attractive. This is a Mep. That's a famous spoon, and I've caught dozens and dozens of salmon on these. A good way of fishing them is casting upstream and spinning down very fast, because the salmon seems to like to turn downstream and chase something just as easily as if it was, well, in fact, it'll chase something going downstream more easily than if it's going upstream. Now, this might sound silly because you would think that a salmon in a river, say, for example, the current's doing 2 miles an hour, and you're holding a bait there in the current, revolving in the current stationary at 2 miles an hour, the salmon has got to move at that 2 miles an hour to take it. But if you're taking it downstream at 3 miles an hour, in actual fact, it's only going 1 mile an hour faster than the current. The fish has only got to turn down and swim at 1 mile an hour to take it.
Exactly.
So it sounds as if you're fishing it 3 times as fast or half as fast again, and yet in actual fact the fish has less effort to take the thing going downstream fast than going upstream slow.
And perhaps quite an effective way of fishing.
Yeah. The most famous of all spoons, ordinary wobbling spoons, is the Toby, the Abu Toby. I carry a lot of these with me because I catch a lot of salmon on these. And it's a simple spoon, easily distinguished because it has, if I can get one out here and show you, it's easily distinguished because it's got 2 like fins on the tail of this Toby. It's a plain simple spoon with treble. It's a wobbling spoon, 2 fins, very, very simple, and yet it's a very, very good fish killer. It's got a beautiful action and it does catch a lot of salmon.
Vary the sizes at all, David?
Yes, again the same thing applies. Use great big ones in the spring for 2 reasons. Well, quite often because the fish are bigger. Spring fish are quite often big fish. So you would use a big one like this. There's a little one hanging on there for the summer, you see. You use a big one like this in the spring for showing up and also for the bigger fish, and also because bigger it's heavier and it gets down deeper. And then in the summer you could go onto a little fella like this, which is much smaller but just as effective in the summer, and the water's gin clear, low, and a great big fish will take a little thing like this or even smaller. But that's probably the most famous of all spoons, the Abu.
We've been about some time of that.
Yes, oh yes. And lots and lots and lots of fishermen use them. I prefer another type of Devon. They were metal Devons which go down deep. Is a wooden Devon. These are wooden Devons which I paint myself, all different colours, dozens and dozens of different colours. There's yellows and, well, you can paint them any colour you like, but yellows and orange and brown and gold and you name it, you can paint it and you can try it, and a fish may well take it. They work well, in my opinion, because they've got a lot of action, because they float. Now, we fish them differently. We use a lead-up trace that can take them down to whatever depth we like, depending on the size of the lead, and we allow the current to do the revolving. So that the current actually, rather than winding them in to revolve them, we let the current do the spinning, so we can fish them very, very slowly, like you would fish a fly, very, very slowly across the current. And I think that's where the success lies, that you fish them very, very slow. And again, because the bright colours are for in the spring, and the larger sizes for in the spring, when the water is dirty and the fish are bigger. And there's, well, I use dozens of them, I make dozens of them.
So that takes care of really the bottom end of the tackle. Now, what
Well,
about
that's the most
actually-
important thing, because whatever tackle you use to get your bait out, you've got to have a bait that the salmon will take.
Shall we take a look at the actual rod and reel that we use?
Well, I'll pick this chap up here. This is a multiplier. It's Abu's multiplier. Now, I think personally, it's only personal opinion, that Abu's make the best multipliers. I've got lots of Abu multipliers. There are many other makes, but these are probably the best of them. And this particular one, I bought this out because this was the one I was using when you came fishing with me once, you might remember, on the on the River Avon, but we can talk about that later on. But you can carry a lot of line on this. There's hold about 200 yards of 14 or 15 pound line, so you've got a lot of line on this particular model, which is the 6500C. Bull races, so it'll last you forever, a good model like this. And you've got enough line for a whopping great fish.
Is that the general breaking strain that you normally use?
14, 15 pound for big fish in the spring. You can go much lighter in the summer. Again, fishing smaller fish, and generally fishing lighter. This is another Abu reel. This is smaller, as you can see. I mean, you compare the two. Doesn't hold the same amount of line. We would use smaller line, smaller strength of line on this. Basically, the design is exactly the same. It's just smaller, lighter, nicer to use in the summer when you tend to be fishing lighter. You do tend to fish lighter in the summer than you would in the spring. The crank handle I like because a multiplying reel is fished on the top.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, normally you fish a reel underneath. We fish this, well, I say on top of the rod. It's not really, because your rings have got to be that way as well, so the whole thing is reversed. But there are rods where you can have a crank handle, which is this sort of angle here, which allows the balance of the reel to stay almost on top, even without having to grip it tightly to keep it there. An ordinary straight through rod, you have to hold it firmly because the reel is, being a weight, is trying to twist it all the time. So by having a crank handle, your finger fits there and your thumb on top. By having the crank handle, you actually find it much easier to handle. You don't have to grip it so much, it's not so tiring on your arm. And if you're fishing all day, maybe if you're a keen angler, 10 or 12 hours, that's something worth looking at.
Certainly.
I don't know that it matters that much. I use straight rods and, all day long, but it is a thing worth looking at. Multipliers for sort of heavier fishing. And then there's fixed spools. Well, I haven't brought any along because you know what a fixed spool is. Most people know what a fixed spool is. And a fixed spool we use for upstream spinning with a mep or something like that, again in the summer for faster fishing and lighter fishing.
So for someone who's really coming into salmon fishing, you'd advise them to buy
well, if they bought a
multiplier
small multiplier, it gives you a great deal of versatility, although you can do it with a fixed spool reel. I mean, you can get fixed spool reels that take any size of line, can't you?
OK, David's given us a broad outline there on the tackle that he uses. So I think the best thing to do is to go and see Dave and Kay now actually salmon fishing.
Salmon fishing. Now, spinning, I showed you the spinners we use. This is a mep type spinner. It's not a mep, but it's the same type of thing. Bar spoon, I use them quite a lot. I've just slung it straight up a tree.
Oops.
But I got it back, you see, I got it back.
Yeah.
And another cast or two and I was into a fish, and it was one of those things where you often in these clear rivers see a fish coming up behind your spoon. I saw a fish coming up behind the spoon, and like the pike that shot in and took the bait, a salmon shot in. It didn't take the bait, but it got foul hooked. Now, old Terry Thomas, he's an authority on salmon. He considers that Atlantic salmon do the same thing as Pacific salmon at times. They knock their prey with their body or their tail to try and stun it before they catch it. This is Sadler's Mill on the River Test, and it's one of those places where there's a ladder that possibly isn't adequate, so the fish try and jump. Well, they can't jump over because it's sluices and the water comes through a hole in the wall, as you might say.
Yeah.
It's coming through at a tremendous speed. We filmed it at 64 frames per second instead of 16, so that's 4 times slower. And here you're slowing it down even more, so it shows the actual speed. If you imagine that water 4 times faster than what you're seeing, and they've got to try and swim that. They can't, so they try and jump it. And they tended to knock themselves against the wall, so they put sandbags there. And to save them knocking themselves about. And eventually, when the water slows down and the flood or whatever's gone, they do get through. These are 3 fish I'm quite pleased with, because I caught these on the Dorset Stour where salmon were few. And I caught these in a couple of hours. I'd fished on the Test in the morning, went up the Stour in the afternoon and clobbered these 3.
In a couple of hours?
Yeah, well,
Incredible.
If the fish are there, you'll catch a salmon first cast if he's there quite often.
Amazing.
I mean, Kay quite often goes to a good lie, and first or second, third cast she's got a salmon if there's one there. You know exactly where to cast after a while. You don't have to flog and flog and flog except for a difficult one. Usually those that have been pricked, and lost, or they've been in the river a while and become almost uncatchable.
I think that's the old the rod you designed there, David, isn't it? The
yeah,
all-rounder.
that's going back a long, long time. We wanted some sort of compromise between Carp rods and Avon rods, and that one's got a test curve of about £1.25. But the remarkable thing is this glass material, if you really leaned into it, you could pull a balance up to £8. If you can visualise £8 pull on a fish, it'd stop a tank.
Certainly would.
So although you wouldn't try and stop them, this one we're getting out here £17. Saw me chasing it up the river and back down again. It's a nice fish.
Beautiful.
Fairly fresh, not sea lice on it, but it hasn't been in the river more than
Is
a
that the
couple of
test
weeks.
there, was it?
That's on the Test, yeah. Nowadays, the size of fish, we used to get a fair number of fish of that weight, and up to over £20. Biggest I've caught is 26. But now the weight's dropped down. Even earlier in the year, we catch them 11, 12, 13, 14 pounds. But the 17, 18s, 20 pounders seem to be much, much scarcer today. Same on the Avon, the weight of the fish has dropped.
Yeah, it's all dropping, isn't it?
Yeah, this is high summer, and the fish, of course, in the summer are small. By small, I mean 7, 8, 9 pounds. as against the springers, which might be much bigger. You notice I've got a float on there.
Yes.
Because the trouble with the test, I mentioned the weed, why I don't fly fish it a lot. There's masses and masses of weed come down the river, and when the weed's coming down the river, the only way we can possibly fish is to put a float on and travel with the weed. So I'll put on a worm or a prawn or something and travel with the weed, because you can't cast a spinner even, because it's only travelled a yard and you've got a great lump of weed on it.
Mm.
So casting upstream and spinning down, occasionally you can manage it when the weed isn't too bad, but it's very difficult. And so I resort to this method, or else I wouldn't be able to fish. And it's one way that we have caught a few fish when weed cutting's in progress. And we've had a lot of fun in amongst the weed, because you get masses of weed on your line, as you can appreciate. A fish on the end as well. And you're following it down the river and come to an obstruction such as here, where Palamine's taking it round a tree for me, and I'm now taking over control again. You notice the centre pin?
I did notice, yes, actually,
Yeah, I love centre pins, and I use them for salmon fishing as well. I spin with them occasionally.
Do you
If I'm using a heavy spinner, or see the weed over the line there, if I'm using a heavy spinner that I can cast from a centre pin, or Devon minnow and a heavy lead or something, wooden Devon and a big lead, I use a big lead in the spring. I'll sometimes fish with a centre pin, just because I like to use a centre pin.
Smashing.
No other reason. You'll remember this fish, Malcolm. This was the first time you ever went salmon fishing, and probably the biggest salmon you'll ever see. It's probably the biggest I'll ever catch. You may remember that you worried me a bit about going salmon fishing. We talked about salmon fishing in the shop. We discussed that, and you'd badgered me, and I said, all right, I'll take you salmon fishing, because I like to see people catch all sorts of fish. So I said, I'll take you salmon fishing, and we arranged our day, and off we went. It was a cold day. I remember we fished the top part of the water first, and we got down to the pub. This is at Ringwood, of course, and we went into the pub because we'd got cold in the morning. We then, and you'll probably remember well, we had perhaps a little bit too much, and then came out afterwards onto the water a little bit, and decided to work down below the bridge. We worked down about 200 yards, and then came to this large bush of, not hawthorn, bramble bush, a big bramble. You remember, a big bramble bush. And just immediately above the bramble, I had a take. You were fishing down behind me, just a few yards upstream. I had a take, and this huge fish thrashed the water to foam and dropped back.
That's what we did.
Dropped back, probably 20 yards on the surface, thrashing the surface to foam. And the line went through the bramble.
That's right.
And we had to get the rod over this damn bramble and free it. Caught up with the fish, which was then, as we thought, under the rod top, and the line was going down at a hell of a pace straight down, which it couldn't do, of course. It was tearing off the reel. Now, obviously you could assume it can't be digging its way to Australia, so the line must have been caught round some obstruction under our feet, or under close into the bank, and it was charging off upriver as it happened, not downriver, and when we cleared the line it was about 60 or 70 yards upstream.
Was it?
You remember that?
Very exciting, wasn't it?
Hell of a line, a hell of a long way.
Of course, at that stage, we had no idea how big the fish was.
Oh, no, I knew it was a good fish, of course.
I mean,
big fish, but you'd get a 20-pounder do the same thing.
Would you?
Oh, yes. So then, if you remember, I put pressure on, brought the fish down, and it came down the opposite bank. As it came down the opposite bank, I slung a lot of side pressure on to bring it under my feet, because downstream there's the railway bridge.
That's right.
And in the high water, because there was not a flood, there'd been a flood and the water's dropping away, but all the girders of the old iron railway bridge all covered in debris, and the fish had gone down through that bridge. We may not have lost it, but we'd have had a hell of a job to get the thing. As it was, I managed to turn it, bring it under our feet, and then it went off upstream again, which we didn't mind. I didn't mind that. And I'll tell you another thing you might remember. My feet were stuck in the damn mud because the water was over the lower bank as it was in flood, and I could hardly move anyway. So I didn't want to move if possible and chase the fish. Off it went up the river again. I think 3 times, didn't it? It went up river a long way.
Yeah, I remember 3 times.
And then we got it under the rod top. We were using a lot of pressure, in fact so much so, and the fish wasn't lifting, so much pressure that at one time I thought it was snagged again, possibly. And I put my hand up the rod, you remember, to put more pressure, lifted, and when I lifted, the fish came up a bit, and I thought it would come to the surface, but it didn't. It went back down again, which surprised me, because even a 25, say, pounder or so, and I thought, I'd had a glimpse of it, and I thought it was about 26, 28 pounds. If you remember, I thought I'd lift it, and it went back down again, as I just said. So I had to try something different. So I managed to clear my feet from the mud, move down a few yards, change angle, and when I changed angle, the fish came straight to the surface, as if it was a tiddler. We swung it round over this lower bank that was covered in water, and I said to you, gaff the bloody thing or something like that, and you did. And it was floundering in the mud. The mud, of course, which was this lower bank with all the water over it, mud and muck and fish, and it didn't look very big. And I said, you would take the damn thing up the bank, you remember? And you were struggling, and I wondered, why is a great big chap like that struggling with a little fish up the bank? Because when you got it up the bank, we washed it off, all the mud, and weighed it. Instead of 26, 28 pounds, as I'd thought, that thing was 39 pounds, which is a big fish. And I don't think a bigger one's been taken off the Avon since that date, although, of course, before then, plenty of bigger ones have been taken off the Avon up to the record, which I think is 49 pounds or 49 and a half. Now, that is a big fish. Make a 39 pounder look a little one.
Oh, sea lice was
yes,
well,
that's right. You asked me what were all these things on the head, and of course they were sea lice, which meant it was a fresh fish that had only been up a couple of days, possibly, from the sea.
That's all you think it's been in the river for?
Probably a couple of days, yeah. But long enough to have got sort of over its tiredness coming up through sluices and up the river against a strong flow. But long enough to have got over its tiredness so that it fought pretty hard, I think. I mean, three big hard runs like that. Oh, and talking about fighting hard, I don't know why you did this, but if you remember, you timed the fight, and you said it took 50 minutes.
50 minutes.
And that's a long time to play a salmon. Most salmon, I mean, I'd kill most 20 pounders 10 to 15 minutes. So that means you should kill a 40 pounder, say, in 20 to 30 minutes. But 50 minutes is a long time. But you remember that fish?
Oh, very vividly.
The first salmon you've seen caught,
Very vividly.
and you had to gaff it. And if you'd lost it, I'd have killed you.
True, David. It's surprising what memories come back, isn't it?
Yeah.